We're delighted that you're joining us for this podcast on handling conflict. My name is Peter Shaw.
And my name's Hilary Douglas. Peter and I have collaborated on a book. We're delighted to be talking about our latest production today.
In lots of our conversations, the theme came out very strongly of people's emotional reactions to conflict. So, Hilary, what stood out in those conversations about emotional reaction to conflict?
Well, what stood out for me most was that this was the key thing. I hadn't necessarily expected that when we started the interviews, but time and again, people were saying it was the facing into conflict in the first place. That was the trickiest thing, and that the most difficult emotions to manage were their own. And people vary so much in their emotional reaction. It might be nature or it might be nurture, but we all know that there are some individuals who at the slightest sign of conflict will charge straight towards it, and others who will retreat as fast as they can, and a few who will freeze. And none of that's surprising because that's how our emotional brains work. But actually realizing that that's what's happening has been a key thing for so many people. And we've got some strong stories to support that.
What I find really helpful is to say to people, when you have an emotional reaction, what data is that giving you? Helping people to sort of stand back from the emotional reaction. What does that tell you about what's going on? And I think people who deal with conflict well are able to recognize their emotional reactions, stand back. It might be an emotional reaction about competitiveness. And so often people go into competitiveness without quite realizing what's happening and how that can be making a situation worse rather than better. Or it's that emotional reaction.
Yeah. And I agree with that. And it's noticing that's going on. So a classic example for many of us would be when you get the email that really annoys you. Interestingly, I think this happens even more by email than it does in the spoken word. And for some people, there is an immediate reaction of how dare they speak to me like that? Or they've got the wrong end of the stick or whatever. And they fire off the response because they haven't got a lot of time to think about it. And it generates a lot of noise and a lot of wasted effort in the end. And talking to leaders who know that is a tendency for them, it's encouraging them to notice that that's their first reaction. Okay, if you've got to write this thing, write it, but then put it in a folder. Come back to it tomorrow or in an hour's time or whatever and ask yourself, do I still want to send that?
Do you think sometimes as well, Hilary, there's an emotional reaction because people want to be liked? And if they feel that somehow a response doesn't appreciate them, that puts them into a bit of a spin and can distort a reaction?
Yes, undoubtedly. And it's not only do they like me, but do they approve of me? Is this a sign of disapproval? And people then beginning to feel, oh, I'm not performing as well as I should, and can go into this sort of downward spiral. And again, it's noticing or learning to notice as people's careers advance that this is what tends to happen. And it is just something that my brain is doing. And there's many leaders who've said to us that in exploring that in a safe space, they've realized it can go back to their childhood or the way that they were brought up. There are examples in the booklet around those who were brought up in an environment where it was best to be seen and not heard and just keep your head down. And it can be quite difficult to break out of that if that's been your conditioning. Similarly, it could be that there was nothing in the home environment that did that, but that a first work experience was with a boss who was a bit of a bully, perhaps. And that has a huge effect. in how you take your career further. So just moving on a bit, what struck you, Peter, as important when people then confront into the conflict and they need a constructive engagement with someone where the thing is not kicked off well?
I think the heart of it is listening, encouraging people to listen, not just to the words, but to the emotions behind the words, the intent behind the words. And I think linked with that is giving somebody full, undivided attention. It's so easy for people to think multitasking is efficient. Multitasking is one of the most destructive impacts on constructive engagement. Even if it's saying, I've got 10 minutes and you have my sole undivided attention for 10 minutes, that full undivided attention is absolutely key. I was talking with somebody just recently about constructive engagement who was saying, whatever anybody says, whether you disagree with it or agree with it, start with the answer yes. Now, you might be saying, yes, that's a really important issue, and there's a whole range of considerations we have to take into account before we make a decision. But responding with the word no immediately creates a situation of tension and difference. So how one responds, how one endeavors to listen effectively and stand in the shoes of the other person. I think so often, if you feel somebody is being obtuse or contrary, sleeping on it, and then thinking, why are they taking that view? And what is it we can align on in a more constructive way to work on together so we can understand each other better? So there is an increased possibility of getting to a decent outcome.
And the other word that I think we try to discourage people from using is but. Yes, but, or no, but. Yes, and can prompt a completely different emotional reaction. And it is all about thinking not just what are my emotions doing, but what are the other person's emotions doing? And one of the other phrases I love around this is, do not assume that you know what this person is thinking or what their motivation is, because assume makes an ass of you and me.
That's a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah.
What do you observe, Hilary, about leaders who draw really well from their wider experience in handling conflict?
A number of the stories that people told us, or that we encouraged them to think about, were about related experiences, maybe outside of the workplace or in a different sort of work context. So I can think of one person who was a very accomplished doctor who was then invited to be on a senior board and thought that conflict was something she couldn't handle, until we talked about dealing with patients every day, some of them really quite difficult. Or there's the parents of teenagers, or toddlers, if you like. We are not suggesting that your work colleagues are like unruly teenagers or difficult toddlers, but you need conflict management techniques dealing with people who are in an emotional state of some sort. Teenagers, perhaps because growing brains and hormonal changes mean that emotions can be at their heights and can vary hugely from 1 hour to the next. And you develop techniques for responding and knowing when you're going to trigger a worse reaction. And I've noticed people sometimes using the idea of red and green conversations, which is from a book by Graham Lee, where he talks about if you're in a very emotional state, that's a red conversation. It's particularly red if both of you are in an emotional state. Your aim is to get to green on both sides, where you recognise there's some emotion to dial down. And you might be the one who sort of takes the responsibility for getting there.
I was talking with a rugby referee recently
Yeah.
who said, when there's conflict on the pitch and I want to tell somebody off or give them a yellow card, I invite them to step 5 paces back with me. So they're separate from the other players, which actually gives them 5 steps, 5 or 6 seconds to realize this is serious.
Yeah.
And he drew parallels from that in a work situation of being careful with your initial response. And also almost to take somebody into a different space. So you're not creating a conflict in a wider group of people than you really need. But I really like your point about drawing lessons from earlier years and childhood. But I think I've come across some people who, because it was so painful, they don't recognize when conflict is going to happen because they've taught themselves to blank it. And I think that can be just as dangerous as somebody who almost flees away from conflict. So it's understanding that context. What are the consequences of one's previous experience? And does this give you insights into conflicts, or do you have to try really hard to spot it?
Yeah. And then that gets multiplied if you're in a team, say, or where one person finds it hard to spot the signs of conflict because they have blanked it out, and the person they're working with is ultra sensitive to conflict, and they can't have a conversation about how they're feeling. And indeed, they may feel, you don't do that. You're a senior person in the workplace. We ignore all of this and we just power on with analysing the particular decision that is in front of us. But there's so much emotional baggage that the best type of decision doesn't get taken. And if I can just come back to people's wider experience, that there's a very salutary lesson in a book by Amanda Ripley called High Conflict, where she has a case study around a very experienced mediation lawyer who spends all of his career mediating between people who are in dispute and in conflict. So he knows everything about how you do this. And then he was persuaded to stand for his local community council where he lived. And he thought, I can do this. And he stood and he was successful and he got the chair post. But then he was so convinced that he knew how to run the show that he managed to antagonize nearly everybody else by telling them how to do it. And didn't realize that this was what was happening until his family pointed out that they were now being blanked by half the community, and that he needed to swallow his pride. So we're all vulnerable. However good we think we are at this, we are all vulnerable. Are there any other examples that occur to you?
Well, I was learning a lot about how a particular rail company responded to a sort of crash that had happened, and really impressed by the person who was in the lead for the rail company, because he recognized there could be conflict with Network Rail, conflict with different people involved, certainly a risk of conflict with the media. And he was wonderfully cool, well thought through, clear, systematic in bringing the right people together, being very clear about what the next steps were, being really clear about what was said to different people, built trust with the media, and ensured that the whole thing didn't escalate. And I think he was a model of bringing thought through, clear, measured approach and not panicking, but being very deliberate. Now, Hilary, you and I worked together over many years on the board of a government department.
Yeah.
And I remember you bristling very hard when the chair of the board and you were sparking about issues. Are you happy to share some of that?
Right, you're putting it mildly. Yeah, I had a very strong emotional reaction, which was I was the only woman on the board, and I felt I was being patronised and talked down to, and I found that quite difficult to swallow. And it happened a few times. And then I had to start thinking, well, what might it be like for the chair who might think this young upstart was trying to argue in front of other people? And that wasn't going to go down well. So it did make me thoughtful. I also had some very wise advice, actually, from you at the time, which I have shared with many women I've worked with since. It still sticks in my throat a little bit that this is how it works, but it works, which is if you perhaps have a highish voice, I'd speak rather fast. For many men, that's quite difficult to tune into, and they are more likely to tune it out. And then you get this awful situation of you've made a good point, it gets ignored, somebody else makes the same point a few minutes later, and it's picked up, and what a good point that was. I think I've learned that that's not deliberate. It's a tuning out. As a result of a conversation we had at that time, I lowered my voice. I spoke more slowly. I took lessons from Mrs. Thatcher, who did exactly the same. And it was effective. And I have suggested it to many of my female clients since, and they've all said, you must be joking. And then they've come back and said, do you know what? It did make a difference.
And during that period, when I was finance director and you were HR director, there were a lot of issues that affected both parts of the organization. And we used to use the approach of talking things through, recognizing when there could be difference or conflict, and trying to reach an objective set of proposals going forward that were the right ones for the organization. And I would often use that as an example about the importance of having early conversations with colleagues in teams so you understand each other's perspective and constraints.
And I think that was driven in part by us both getting interested at that time in coaching, because there'd been some internal work going on, and we'd observed some good coaching and thought, well, that's really interesting. Maybe there is a more productive way of getting things done by actually seeking to understand better where the other person is coming from, and not to take it personally when roles lead to differences of priorities or opinions. And I have, one of the examples in the booklet was talking to someone who was the finance director on a board, and who was trying to control another executive director who was trying in their turn to be as independent as possible. And they had a standoff for about a year before the finance director realised it was their roles that were setting them up to disagree rather than them as individuals, and took the first step to say, let's have an off-the-record conversation about this. We could do it differently.
Can I take us into what have you learnt from situations which seemed intractable? How have we helped leaders cope with that sort of sense of it's not going to end?
This can go very deep and be very personal and painful, or it might be a very practical thing. If it's a very practical thing where individuals, teams, organisations are not going to find a way to agree, then the leaders we talk to would say, do you know what? You have to decide how important is this in the great scheme of things? Maybe we aren't going to find a solution, but what's the impact of that if we don't? Are we getting it all out of proportion? maybe we can just let this one ride in the interests of longer term collaboration. Or sometimes this is so important, we've got to find a way through. We might have to get a third party to mediate because we can't let it fester. Where it's personal and the individual is feeling a bit trapped by a conflict with another person or the institution, I think it is then much more difficult. But what people have told us is it's when they most need someone outside of the conflict to be alongside them, either to help them see that perhaps there is another way of looking at this, or to help them cope with the pressure that it's putting on them, and just recognise that this too will pass.
I think that theme of this too will pass, which can feel quite a trite phrase, actually will ring true for people. Because often if somebody's in a difficult, intractable situation, they've had something like it before, and it has passed.
Yeah.
The reason I was talking with somebody who felt in a very intractable situation, his way of handling it was to go for a 100-kilometre bike ride every Saturday morning. He needed something to vent, and venting was going very fast on a bike ride with a couple of other people who are in similarly rather stressful jobs.
Yeah. I've known people with punch balls. I've known people who have gone down to the sea and screamed. You know, whatever it is that lets that emotion out. I think the other thing is that the more experienced the leaders are and the more they can look back on, they may often see that something that seemed awful at the time was actually a turning point in their career and led to new opportunities that they might not have envisaged. And they went through a very painful transition, but they can look back and say, do you know what? Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all.
And I think as well, it's sometimes helping people recognise it's not all on your shoulders.
Yeah.
You think it's your problem to solve, when actually it's not only your problem, it's other people's problem as well. And that overdeveloped sense of responsibility can be a real burden, which almost makes an intractable situation even harder to handle.
Yes. I do agree with that. I can think of a few people I know who have been brought up to feel that they are the ones who must solve whatever the problem is. And we might describe it now as the heroic leader complex, but that's not really what's going on. It's a sense of, I must do this by myself. That's what I've been trained to do. I am somehow letting myself down if I can't solve it. So, Peter, what do you notice in teams when teams have to handle conflict?
You and I both do quite a lot of teamwork. And often we're brought in when there has been conflict or been underlying conflict. And key has been talking to people in advance to try and understand what are the underlying reasons for the conflict and how has it surfaced and what have been some of the detrimental effects. And helping people understand why conflict has happened, both individually and then in the team itself, can be hugely cathartic. Often it happens because there's a misunderstanding of roles, or there's a particular distorted view of history. And I think we both found that actually drawing these themes out enables people to look more objectively about what's been happening. And often we're trying to prompt open conversations, both about what has worked well and what can be improved in the future. And so often people get preoccupied with a negative and forget that the team has actually made progress. And also tend to forget what the purpose of the team is. So enabling people to recrystallize the purpose, to articulate what has gone well, then gives a new foundation to look forward. And also key in the work with teams has been helping them anticipate when conflict might happen and how they're going to handle that conflict before it does happen. Often I find with teams, you have a really good conversation with them and you say, what are the elephants in the room? What has not been said that needs to be said? And now's the moment to do it. And then that sometimes leads to a whole new level of conversation. And you're not quite certain where it's going to go. And your job is to try and release the tension and help the body build back itself together at the end, stronger than when it entered.
And the other thing we remind them of is that a certain degree of conflict is almost inevitable in a team, unless it's a team of clones, because you don't want groupthink. You want diversity of views. Often a great deal of effort has gone into recruiting for diversity. So it's then about how do you constructively deal with the differences between you and recognize when you've got an emotional reaction to what somebody else is saying simply because it's different from what you think, or because the way they express it is different from the way that you would express it. And they're not necessarily attacking you when they're saying something with great conviction. They may simply have great conviction.
And I've sometimes found it helpful to get people to articulate, how do they handle conflict outside work in a way that is constructive? It might be with their teenagers, it might be in the football club, or with the planning department, and people sharing their own experience of conflict outside work often gives real insights that their colleagues find insightful.
And also they may then find it more easily to describe how emotions come into it. So we all know how furious we can feel if we are having a phone call with a service provider and they're not treating us well. And yet how different it is if you're having a phone call about the same problem with someone who is sympathetic in their response. They may not be able to help any more than the first person could, but the way they deal with it makes for a completely different type of conversation. And sometimes if you give that sort of analogy, it can help defuse what's going on in the room. And I've also, again, we give some of these examples in the booklet, team leaders saying, sometimes what I do is I invite everyone to think that they're standing on the balcony watching us and watching the way that we behave. And what would they say about the way that we're behaving and what they're noticing?
Hilary, what do you notice when organizations are in conflict? And what have we learned from other people, but also from our own experience, actually, of being heavily involved in merger situations? What do we learn about what works best for leaders in handling organizational conflict?
So, again, this came up in the interviews, that organizations have different interests often, and yet there is some reason why they have to collaborate. It might be a merger, or it might be a partnership on a particular thing, or it might simply be that there's a contract that's got to be finalized, and the shared purpose is we've got to get there, but we have very different motivations in how we want to do it. And what we notice is the same sorts of principles coming forward, that you want to understand where the other's coming from. You want to understand what the levers might be, the things that they really care about. Is there something that you can concede which will give them what they care about, whilst protecting the things that most matter to you? And can you keep a distinction from the personal and the professional. So, like you, I've had to manage a number of mergers, in our case with government departments, or divestments, and the big issue has always been money. And what was this going to mean for the budget of each organisation involved? And my job was to get the best deal possible for my department. But I needed to remember that the other guy was doing his job as well, and there was nothing to stop us being perfectly friendly about it and reaching a conclusion. We just needed to find a way of getting the best outcome that we could.
I think we've both been involved in situations where there's been a difference between the principals or the leading people in two organizations. And one's just had to get on and build good working relationships and find a solution, not letting a senior level relationship contaminate the importance of good working relationships at working level. So it's that sort of emotional detachment and seeking to out what is in the best interest of the customer, the taxpayer, the different stakeholders. And if there's a bit of sort of ego happening at senior levels, to sort of not let that get in the way.
Yeah. And we haven't used the trust word much in the conversation so far. And yet trust is so important in all of this, building trust between individuals, between teams, between organizations. And the example you've just given is where you and the person you're dealing with at the other organization, you need to trust each other enough that you're not going to drop each other in it with the principal. And we've both been there.
And is there also something about when leaders feel there's conflict between two organizations, trying to narrow down what is it where there's conflict? It may actually be on a fairly narrow point, but it's sort of contaminated the whole conversation.
Sometimes it's because these two individuals have had a run-in in the past about something. It's actually nothing to do with the issue. It's some personal antagonism which has been left hanging. And again, if there's a way of getting to the bottom of that, perhaps by talking to their chief of staffs or whatever, and thinking, we're not going to be able to solve that one, but we know it's been an issue. Can we use our knowledge of that to de-escalate things? And it might be a matter of their pride. Yeah, how do we deal with this so nobody's pride is affected? So you talked a bit about spotting potential conflict before it happens. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
When somebody starts a new role, I'd often say to them, who can you talk to in advance? Before you actually are in the seat, the staff, the customers, even the critics, to find out what are their fears, what are their concerns, what are their aspirations. So you're sort of building a sensitivity about where there is conflict or there might be conflict before you enter the seat. And I think it's also leaders being aware for an organizational team, what has been the history? What have been the conflicts in the past? What might be just below the surface that could break out in unpredictable ways? What are the past patterns, both related to the team, but also to the individuals in the team? And the final thing I'd say to leaders, and I know that they're often found this has worked for them, who are your sources of intelligence? Who will tell you what's really going on here? And this is where if somebody has a chief of staff or an executive assistant or a close colleague working with them, saying to that person, tell me what you pick up and share with me where you think there might be some undercurrents it's good to be aware of.
Yeah, agree with all of that. And just to add, we talk a bit in the booklet about the book written by our colleague Joy Harkup with her writing partner Helen Hopper about boards and the dynamics on boards, and where often, and we've both been on boards as well, and we've seen all of this, the cliques develop. The conflict isn't yet out in the open, but you begin to notice that different smaller groups are talking to each other and not sharing with the entire group. Or some individuals or groups are dominating the conversation in the board meetings and other things are being left unsaid. And again, the chair will want to find a way of servicing that. They will probably have some conversations offline in order to find out what's going on. As you said, they might talk to some of the allies as well. But if you begin to get a sense that there's something beneath the surface, this needs to be brought out or it's going to poison things a bit. And there's another sort of quote in the booklet, which is, "Don't let it stew or it seeps." And I like that.
What are the personal stories that have struck you most about people handling conflict well?
Well, some of them are deeply personal. There are individuals who had very difficult upbringings, which they've tried just to not talk about or to park somewhere. And yet it's influenced the way that they deal with conflict. It may make them very fearful of conflict, or it may mean that they grew up thinking you've got to really fight for yourself every minute of the day. And I've been very struck by the honesty of those individuals when they've been ready to talk about it. I mean, sometimes it's only when they start talking with us that they acknowledge themselves that this has been an influence. So those stories have been very powerful. There was the story too about the leader who early in her career told a manager couldn't deal with a particular conflict that was going on and asked the manager to do it. And the manager did. And the individual said, "Thank you, I just don't like dealing with conflict." And the manager said, "Nor do I. Nobody likes it." But that's not the point. As leaders, we need to face into conflict. And that individual said this was a lesson carried throughout their leadership journey, that facing into conflict and finding a way of resolving it is part of your role as a leader and your service to the team. What about you?
Example I would share of conflict in an organization that had become really difficult, and a very experienced leader came in and talked to all the key people and produced a short, compelling narrative about what had happened, which summed it up so well that everybody said, "That's it, that is what happened." And it provided a new starting point.
Right.
Because they all trusted this person and their report, and it created a new bench, a new starting point from which they could move forward. So that was one that struck me.
And yes, another interesting one is humour. Humour is great sometimes for defusing conflict. Just occasionally it backfires. And there's a couple of leaders I know who have learned that over time, that the quip that comes to mind might work 80% of the time, but it might bomb the other 20% of the time. So even when you're going to use humour, it's worth just pausing for a moment thinking, is this the right audience for this?
And finally, Hilary, we had lots of conversations with people about handling conflict. What's your overall reflections from those conversations?
So, almost coming back to the beginning, I had started out on this thinking that we would be writing something about the techniques that people use for managing conflict and that we might have a wide variety of techniques. What emerged so strongly was that it starts not with techniques, but with recognizing your own vulnerability in terms of your emotions and understanding where those emotions come from, accepting that you can't change yourself overnight. This might be quite a slow process, but giving yourself small steps and critically finding a way to pause before you react. And then looking at it from the other end of the telescope, if you're like that, then everybody else you deal with is like that too. And so you may need to give them a bit more understanding when they seem to act very unreasonably in a conflict.
I think my takeaway is very similar about in coaching, helping people to reflect on, are they captive to their default reactions? Or can they stand outside their default reactions and bring a variety of perspectives and be deliberate in how they respond to conflict rather than just automatically responding? I think my other reflection is about on teams is it's so easy for teams to have an embedded reaction about how they treat the others, the outsiders, the people who they're in competition with or in conflict with, and get into a terrible groupthink of admiring the problems and not breaking out into saying, okay, conflict sometimes creates opportunities for a new start, opportunity for a new engagement that can be constructive.
And maybe we can't round this topic off completely without recognizing that there is a huge amount of conflict in the world between communities, between nations, and that sometimes the conflict that we're talking about might seem a bit insignificant by comparison, but it's driven by many of the same emotional reactions, communities to each other, nations to each other. And there's got to be a will on all sides to reach a conclusion before you can reach a conclusion. But I loved the quote from George Mitchell, who negotiated the Good Friday agreements, or was the key negotiator, when he said one of the Northern Irish participants said afterwards, "You listened us into submission."